My name is Elise Auerbach, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Todd Herrenkohl. Todd is the Marian Elizabeth Blue Professor of Child and Family at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. He has a variety of research interests, but his primary research focuses on child and family well-being, with a particular emphasis on child maltreatment and the psychosocial and developmental underpinnings of health risk behaviors in both youth and adults. He also studies substance abuse, mental and physical health outcomes of adversity, and resilience. So thank you, Dr. Herrenkohl, for being with me today. I'm so excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
So your research is really in the area of children's exposure to adversity and the impacts that have on their life's course of development. When we think about that research perspective in the context of the current migration crisis, what are some of the triggers that we're seeing as examples of early childhood adversity?
Yeah, so a good deal of my work, as you said, focuses on adversity, and that often leads to conversations about trauma in kids. And so I thought maybe it would be helpful to start by just defining trauma, or how we think about trauma. And that typically is a child's exposure to some deeply disturbing event, something that causes emotional crisis. Can be associated with both physical injury sometimes, as well as emotional injury. And for some kids, the impacts of trauma can be a lifetime of hardship. And so, typically we think about trauma as being associated with things like child abuse and neglect, exposure to violence and those kinds of things, natural disasters also. In this case, what's disturbing is that we see these events unfolding, and they have all the marks of extremely traumatic and damaging kinds of interactions and experiences for kids. In these particular, in the crisis we're seeing unfold, we're particularly concerned not just about the immediate events of what kids are encountering, in the moment, but also the adversity that they've experienced before that, and the potential for what we think about as compounding trauma. So the idea of kids who are victimized or experience trauma in one context, moving into another, and experiencing more of the same. So in kids, sometimes what we see is that they've been victimized in one form and then re-victimized in another. And the consequence of that is that at each point, children are sort of further vulnerable to the symptoms that we know to be associated with adversity. So the worry in this case is that rather than looking at ways to support kids and to mitigate the effects of earlier trauma, we're actually adding to it by putting them into a very unpredictable, perhaps unsafe environment, and taking away their sources of social support and surrounding them with people and contexts that they know nothing about.
Absolutely. So do you think that it would be fair to say that given that this migration is generally driven by asylum seekers who are fleeing really horrible circumstances, that the stress of that then combined with the effects of what's happening on the other side of the border is giving rise to this compounding trauma that you're describing?
I think that there's no question about that. That there is not an individual who can sort of navigate his or her way through those kinds of experiences and not be impacted negatively by them. I think, again, that the evidence suggests that most of these kids and families have experienced incredibly damaging experiences in areas that they're fleeing from. They're seeking safety and refuge here in the U.S. And then what they encounter is not support and reassurance, but further trauma and further hardship.
So I'd really like to dig in now to some of the effects of these traumas and these hardships, especially as they get compounded. So could you talk a little bit about the physical and mental impact of this type of trauma, how it manifests in symptoms, how long these things last?
Sure. Yeah. In very young children, we see what we see actually in the news accounts that we've seen so far. Tantrums, the inability to be soothed and comforted. Sometimes we see, excessive and uncontrollable crying, agitation, difficulty focusing, fear of adults. So in very young kids, again, we're seeing those very things front and center. In slightly older kids, we start to see manifestations in aggressive behavior, and inability to focus and stay sort of on task. And so we, in the United States anyway, we focus a lot on how trauma manifests in school settings and how kids struggle because of their trauma histories in that case. And there's increasing evidence. Some of the work that I've done and others too show that the effects of trauma can actually continue into adulthood, into midlife. And there is mounting evidence that individuals who, as children, experience trauma are at risk for substance abuse, mental health disorders of various forms, the early onset of disease, and even premature death. So there is absolutely no question that the effects of trauma can be long-lasting, and without intervention, that there is a higher likelihood that individuals will encounter the things I named.
So you mentioned interventions, and I'm curious if you could describe a little bit any kinds of mechanisms or interventions that might work to counteract some of this type of trauma, and how do they work?
So here's the ironic thing, in the current circumstance. So one of the things that is most consistently and most strongly recommended for kids who've encountered trauma is creating for them safe, stable, nurturing environments, and creating very strong bonds of attachment between those kids and trusted adults. And so the very sort of evidence-based practice, if you will, that we know to be so important for kids is taken off the table, in this case. Kids are in very unpredictable surroundings. They're taken away from the adults who they trust most, and they are put in situations that potentially are unsafe. So that the very approach that I and other experts would recommend is simply not possible in this case.
So I'm curious to dig into this a little bit more deeply. You say that the social support structure is really critical to trying to mitigate some of the effects of these traumas. We've understood the developing nature of this situation to have progressed from not just separating families, but considering detaining them indefinitely. Does that mitigate some of the effects of this trauma, or and if not, how is it also traumatizing for these small children?
I think that there is no question that keeping kids and their parents together is a positive thing. That I applaud. What is concerning, however, going forward, is the potential for long-term detention in conditions where you're housing children of different ages. Again, many of whom have experienced trauma of various forms and will manifest some of the symptoms that I've named. The mental health needs of these kids and of their parents, their physical health needs may go untreated, and the longer they stay in detention, the less likely it is that they are going to be treated adequately, not just for the trauma symptoms that they have, but various other things as well. So at this step to keep kids and families together is a positive. The idea of retaining them and not addressing their needs adequately is an ongoing concern.
Absolutely. I'm curious to dig into what might be positive effects that, or positive approaches that the government might take to try and mitigate some of the effects of this long-term detainment. What types of interventions might be helpful to reduce the negative impact of that?
I think sort of focusing on limiting the amount of time that kids and families are housed in unsafe, potentially unsafe and unpredictable environments would be one step in the right direction. Looking at ways of creating safe spaces for children and addressing their mental health and physical health needs would be another. I think attending to the needs of adults in a compassionate, supportive way, not in a punitive approach, is also going to have implications for the kids. And so, as we think about taking steps toward addressing this crisis a bit more humanely and effectively, we really need to consider both the needs of the kids and the adults, and creating that safety and those strong bonds of attachment that we know to be so critical.
Absolutely. And similarly, if we also think about this for what we can try and do, what can people advocate for in terms of individual and family-centered policies and communities as we move forward and try and think about a longer-term, more robust solution to the end of this crisis?
As I have a background mostly in kind of the prevention science area. One of the steps the things we always advocate for is looking at the root causes of problems, whatever they might be, and not spending as much time and effort treating the symptoms. And I think in this particular case, we're dealing with a crisis that demands attention, and it should receive it in the way that we're providing it. And people should speak out, as I hope I am, about what I see the needs to be in this case. But at the same time, I think we also need to focus on the international crisis that exists around violence and the experiences that are causing families the level of distress that clearly they are experiencing elsewhere. So generating conversations about ways to eradicate violence, I think, is a critical need. Generating a conversation about compassionate care and ways of embracing families and not tearing them apart, I think is something that we need to do here locally, domestically, and it also needs to be a broader conversation. So, I'm encouraged by, quite honestly, by the quick and very aggressive response I think that we saw on the part of the general public to what we witnessed in the news and heard about. And I just hope that it's an impetus to going about the practice of dealing with vulnerable families in a very different way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Herrenkohl, for joining me today to share your expertise. We really appreciate your perspective. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this discussion.